Let me take you into a courtroom where a nurse walked in wearing blood-stained scrubs and changed the law without even raising her voice. She didn't ask for sympathy. She showed up tired, honest, and real. What happened next wasn't just a custody case, it was a reckoning. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing in the room isn't the gavel, it's the truth. 8:57 a.m., Brighton Falls Family Courthouse loomed against the gray Pennsylvania sky, its marble columns already framed by news cameras and curious onlookers. Riverline News was live. TikTok captions flickered. Custody showdown, nurse or neglect. The doors opened. Casey Monroe stepped out of a silver sedan, scrubs wrinkled, blood-specked, and unmistakably real. Her dark green top clung to her after a 12-hour shift in the trauma unit at St. Jude's. A faded ivy band still hugged her wrist. Her sneakers, worn and quiet, barely made a sound on the courthouse steps. She didn't smile. She didn't scan the crowd. One hand clutched her custody file, the other stayed clenched at her side like a dam holding something back. People stared. Some whispered. Others just watched, expecting collapse, or at least an apology. Inside, the courtroom was colder than outside. At the plaintiff's table, attorney Malcolm Tate leaned toward Casey's ex-husband, murmuring something smug. The man chuckled. Across the room, a court clerk flipped through dockets, but her eyes kept darting toward Casey's stained uniform. Then the judge arrived. Evelyn Radford, silver hair twisted into a severe bun, sat high on the bench. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Casey. They paused, hardened. Her voice cracked like frost. "Ms. Monroe, are you under the impression this courtroom is a trauma bay?" A ripple passed through the gallery, gasps, snickers, even a few raised brows. Casey didn't flinch. Her voice came low but even, cracking at the edges from exhaustion, not emotion. "This uniform is stained with the blood of a 7-year-old boy who coded at 417 IMI. I didn't have time to change. I had time to choose. Save him, or dress for you." Silence. A thud in the chest of everyone present. The courtroom froze. The woman in the third row pulled out her phone, hit record. The court reporter blinked, forgot to type. Nina Everett, the court clerk, looked up, stunned. Judge Radford hesitated just for a moment. Then, sharp as ever, "Let's proceed." But the room had already changed. Casey hadn't raised her voice. She'd simply shown up, with blood, fatigue, and the kind of truth that leaves no room for polish. Malcolm Tate rose slowly from his chair, smoothing the front of his tailored suit like it was part of a ritual. His cufflinks glinted beneath the recessed lights. The courtroom camera lights caught the gold of his watch as he approached the podium, voice calm but cutting. "Ms. Monroe, you chose a night shift over your own custody hearing. Is it fair to say your job comes first?" A few murmurs flickered through the gallery like static. Casey didn't blink. She exhaled once, a slow breath from somewhere deeper than exhaustion. "No, sir," she replied, her voice low but unwavering. "I chose to be the kind of mother I'd pray would show up if my daughter ever stopped breathing at 4 a.m. The room stilled. Malcolm opened his mouth, perhaps to interrupt, but Casey continued without waiting. "And this job you question, it pays for her roof, her inhaler, and the therapy she needed when her father walked out. I didn't choose work over my child. I chose survival, for both of us." Her hands rested in her lap now, steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at the judge, or Malcolm, or even the gallery. She simply stared ahead, like someone who had lived too much to perform. A beat passed, then another. At the clerk's table, Nina Everett leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "This isn't a hearing anymore. This feels like history." Malcolm shifted his weight. His next question came slower, thinner, stripped of its edge. Judge Radford sat perfectly still, but her fingers tapped once. Barely audible, against the bench. Her eyes hadn't left Casey since the moment she spoke. Outside the courtroom, the clip of Casey's earlier response, "Save a life or change for you, I chose the life," had crossed 120,000 views in just under half an hour. The hashtags spread like brushfire: respect, the uniform, Scrubs justice, Let her speak. Brighton Daily Chronicle ran the headline before lunch. Blood on her sleeves, dignity in her voice. And in that quiet courtroom, Casey Monroe hadn't won anything yet. But she had already changed everything. By the second hour, the courtroom air had thinned. Casey sat still, her posture straighter than her body wanted, her fingers unconsciously rubbing the faded IV mark on her wrist. Her face was pale, drawn not just from fatigue but from the slow, grinding realization that momentum was slipping. Malcolm Tate kept pressing. He circled her testimony with surgical precision, emphasizing her lack of preparedness, her lack of professionalism. Jared McLean tried to push back, but his voice lacked weight. He was earnest, but outgunned. Across the aisle, Casey caught a glimpse of her ex-husband whispering to Malcolm, both exchanging the kind of smug smiles that sink anchors in your chest. And then something shifted. The heavy oak doors creaked open mid-hearing, loud enough to pull every eye in the room toward the back. A woman entered, brisk, deliberate. A white coat swayed over her slate-gray dress. Her hospital badge glinted under the recessed lights. Dr. Angela Rowe. Casey's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known. No one had told her. Her eyes widened as the seasoned ER chief walked past the stunned bailiff and directly to the witness stand. She carried no files, no folders, just a presence that bent the room. Angela was sworn in, then faced the courtroom, not with protocol, but with purpose. Casey Monroe, she began, her voice even but weighted, is the nurse I call when everyone else freezes. When no parent is there and a child is coding, she's the one who stays. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't ask. She acts. The room hushed. She went on. Speaking of Casey skipping meals 26 days straight, staying over on holidays, covering shifts for others without question, her words weren't legal argument. They were truth, in raw linen. Then, Angela reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper. This letter, she said, voice trembling slightly, was written this morning, by the parents of the boy Casey saved. She read aloud. If not for Casey, our son wouldn't be breathing. Give her children back. She's earned them 100 times over. Silence. A shift, not procedural but human. Judge Radford didn't speak. She didn't strike her gavel. For the first time, her eyes found Casey's. Not with judgment, but with something closer to reckoning. And in that quiet, Casey Monroe wasn't on defense anymore. She was seen. Judge Evelyn Radford cleared her throat and announced a recess. 45 minutes. No elaboration, no eye contact, just a formal pause to review the testimony and accompanying documentation. Her gavel didn't strike. It didn't need to. The silence had already hit harder than wood ever could. Casey remained seated, her hands lightly clasped in her lap. Her eyes didn't search for anyone. They focused on the air in front of her, the stillness, the waiting. The exhaustion across her face didn't ask for pity. It only said, I'm still here. Beside her, Jared McLean leaned in, his voice low and reverent. You didn't raise your voice once, he murmured, and now the whole system's holding its breath. Up front, court clerk Nina Everett flipped back through her stenography pad. Her fingers trembled slightly, the pen slipping once before she caught it. Across the room, a reporter for Riverline News slipped outside, phone already to her ear. Her voice cracked into the quiet hallway. Forget legal drama. This is moral truth. The gallery began to empty, not because they were leaving, but because they needed air, and yet no one left the building. They lingered, leaned against walls, clustered quietly in corners, waiting, not for a ruling, but for something bigger, something that felt like justice learning to speak again. When the courtroom reconvened, Judge Radford entered slowly. She sat taller now, but her hands rested softer. This time she didn't lift the gavel. She simply spoke. We've seen polished liars in this room, she began, eyes settling on Casey. Today, we saw a woman in scrubs, still bearing the stain of sacrifice, and we tried to shame her for it. A pause. Then she looked around, at the press, the legal teams, the people who had stopped seeing and started witnessing. I owe Ms. Monroe not a verdict, not deference, but an apology." The room didn't erupt, it cracked, open. Malcolm Tate's pen dropped to the table. His mouth opened, but no words followed. Nina blinked fast, trying to stop the tears. Jared didn't speak. He just nodded, jaw tight with something that felt like belief. And for the first time that day, the courtroom didn't feel like a theater of procedure. It felt like truth had finally been sworn in. The courtroom was silent, but not still. Breathless, tense. Every seat was taken, and still a line of people stood quietly at the back, refusing to leave. The air felt suspended, as if time had folded in on itself, waiting for something irreversible. Casey Monroe sat next to her attorney, Jared McLean. Her hands rested on her lap, marked with faint red lines from hours of being clenched. She hadn't looked at the clock in a while. She didn't want to know how long Emily had been waiting outside, how long her daughter had been wondering where her future might land. Judge Evelyn Radford entered without her usual air of distance. She moved slower, with purpose. As she reached the bench, she didn't adjust her papers or clear her throat. She simply looked at Casey. Her expression, for the first time, softened, quiet but unshakably resolved. "This court has reviewed the testimony, the evidence, and, perhaps most importantly, the impact," Radford said, her voice low and steady. A pause stretched, no one blinked. "Full legal and physical custody shall remain with Ms. Casey Monroe." The words rang like a bell, and yet no one moved. Radford looked down briefly, then back up again. "True decorum is not appearance," she added. "It is sacrifice without complaint." No gavel, just the sound of breathing and something breaking open inside every person in that room. Jared leaned toward Casey, touching her shoulder lightly. "You did it," he whispered. But Casey didn't respond. Her eyes closed. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Not out of triumph, but relief. After everything, she didn't have to fight with words anymore. Her life had spoken for itself. No applause followed, only silence. One woman near the door covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes glistening. Outside, Janet Rhodes from Riverline News was already broadcasting. The ruling in Brighton Falls today wasn't just legal, it was human. The scrabs that changed everything walked out of that courtroom carrying not a victory, but a truth. Hashtags ignited across TikTok, X, and news sites. The scrubs that spoke. Heart standard. And then Casey emerged, still in her stained scrubs, still standing tall. Emily ran to her mother, small arms wrapped tight around Casey's waist, face buried against her. No one asked questions. No reporters shouted. The crowd parted, slowly and deliberately, forming a pathway of quiet reverence. And together, mother and daughter walked through it, unbothered, unbroken, seen. 1 week after the verdict, the Pennsylvania state legislature convened in a special session. The topic? Court dress codes and how they failed to recognize the realities of those who serve beyond the 9 to 5. The gallery was packed, not with lawyers, but with nurses, EMTs, janitors still in their night shifts, holding their badges like quiet protest signs. By a sweeping vote, the Hart Standard passed into law. Professionalism, the resolution declared, is not defined by the polish of a suit, but by the purpose behind the scrubs. Courts across the state began revising their policies. In Brighton Falls, the updated courthouse signage included a line now etched in brass: "Scrubs are welcome when worn in service." At St. Jude Regional Medical Center, a letter arrived with the seal of the U.S. Labor History Museum. They asked for Casey Monroe's scrubs, specifically the ones she wore to court. They wished to display them next to the firefighter boots from Ground Zero and the miner's gloves from West Virginia. Casey didn't answer right away. She folded the scrubs carefully, placed them in a plain shipping box, and wrote 3 words on the label: "Worn with purpose." She didn't do interviews, didn't sit on late-night couches or accept any awards. She clocked in, she showed up, she warmed soup from a can. She fell asleep with her daughter's breath pressed against her neck. One evening, a fellow nurse asked, "Aren't you afraid people will forget?" Casey smiled gently. "I don't need to be remembered. I just need to be seen when it matters." And then, on an ordinary morning, she walked Emily to school. The sidewalks were damp with autumn dew. The breeze nudged falling leaves across their path. Emily looked up, her voice small and sure. "Mom, can I wear scrubs when I grow up?" Casey bent down, tightening her daughter's backpack strap. "You can wear anything, honey," she said. "Just know who you're showing up for." As they crossed the street hand in hand, the world didn't cheer, didn't stop, but it watched. And it remembered. Some uniforms carry more than blood. They carry truth. Sometimes strength doesn't come dressed in perfection. It walks in wearing fatigue, grace, and purpose. The quiet ones, the exhausted ones, the ones who never ask to be seen, often carry the kind of truth that shifts entire rooms. Because real impact isn't loud, it shows up, even when it's hard. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more stories that speak where silence once stood.